As I stood in the elegantly decorated living room of my parents' home, the laughter and chatter of my sister's engagement party filled the air, but all I could feel was the weight of my mother's disapproving gaze. I was reminded yet again that I was the less favored daughter, overshadowed by my sister Sarah's seemingly perfect life. My mother made snide remarks about my career choices and belittled my accomplishments in front of Sarah's future in-laws, leaving me with a familiar sense of inadequacy. The engagement ring sparkled on Sarah's finger, a symbol of her success, while I felt invisible and irrelevant. With Sarah's big day coming up, I knew I had to decide whether to confront my family or remain silent. But as the night wore on, the urgency to break free from this toxic cycle became overwhelming. Every time I visited my parents, it was the same story. Sarah was praised for her achievements while I was constantly compared to her. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" my mother would ask, while my father would nod in agreement, reinforcing the unspoken rule that my worth was measured against Sarah. I had spent countless hours working late nights on projects, only to hear my mother dismiss my accomplishments as not that impressive. The emotional toll was accumulating. I felt like a ghost in my own family. As my eyes wandered around the room, I noticed the expensive gifts and attention showered on Sarah. It was clear. I was expected to contribute financially to the party while my efforts were taken for granted. The pressure was mounting, and I could sense that something had to give. Every time I stepped into my parents' house, it felt like I was walking into a trap. The air was thick with expectations, and I could almost hear the unspoken rules echoing in my mind. My mother, with her critical gaze, always seemed ready to pounce on any flaw I might display. And then there was Sarah, my sister, who was the golden child. It was like I was stuck in a never-ending competition where the rules were rigged against me. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" my mother would say, her voice dripping with disappointment. I could feel my father nodding in agreement, reinforcing the belief that I was somehow lesser. It was exhausting. I had spent years trying to prove my worth, pouring my heart into my career, only to have it dismissed as not that impressive. I remember the countless late nights spent working on projects that I thought would finally earn my parents' respect. But every time I shared my success, my mother would find a way to downplay it. "Oh, that's nice, dear. But did you hear about Sarah's promotion?" It was as if my achievements were mere footnotes in the grand story of Sarah's life. As I looked around the room during the engagement party, I felt the familiar pang of inadequacy wash over me. The decorations were lavish, the food was extravagant, and the expensive gifts piled up around Sarah. It was a celebration of her success, and I was just a shadow lingering in the background. The laughter and joy in the air only served to amplify my feelings of invisibility. Despite my efforts, I had never managed to escape the role of the overlooked daughter. The pressure mounted as I realized I was expected to contribute to the financial burden of this party, while my own accomplishments were taken for granted. I watched as my mother beamed with pride over Sarah's engagement, her excitement palpable, while I was left to fend for myself in this toxic environment. It was clear that my parents saw me as nothing more than a resource, a financial contributor who was expected to support Sarah's dreams. Every time I visited, the same script played out. I had become accustomed to the unsaid rules. Sarah was the star, and I was the supporting character in her story. I felt like a ghost, floating through my own family gatherings, desperate to be noticed but always overshadowed. I could sense the mounting costs of this favoritism, not just in terms of money but also in my emotional well-being. I was exhausted from constantly measuring my worth against my sister's achievements. It wasn't just the financial expectations. It was the emotional toll that came with it. I felt like I was in a never-ending cycle of proving myself, but no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. The burden of comparison weighed heavily on my shoulders, and I could feel the cracks beginning to show. As I stood there watching everyone fawn over Sarah, I knew something had to give. The pressure was becoming unbearable. I felt a fire ignite within me, a desire to break free from this cycle of toxic favoritism. I needed to find my voice and reclaim my worth, but the thought of confronting my family terrified me. What if I lost them altogether? But then again, what was the price of staying silent? I glanced at Sarah, who was blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing inside me. She was basking in the attention, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment. I had always been the one in the shadows, the one expected to support her, to celebrate her victories while my own went unnoticed. But no more. I was done being the invisible sister, the family doormat who was expected to carry the weight of their expectations. The urgency to act grew stronger as I contemplated the future. I had to decide whether to confront my family about the favoritism or continue to suffer in silence. The thought of standing up for myself was both terrifying and exhilarating. I realized that I was tired of being defined by my sister's success. I was ready to reclaim my story, to carve out my identity beyond the family dynamics that had suffocated me for so long. As the night wore on, I could feel the tide shifting within me. I had spent too long being silent, too long allowing myself to be belittled and overshadowed. It was time to break free. No more silence. No more compliance. I was ready to face my family and demand the respect I deserved. Just as I thought the night couldn't get any worse, I overheard my parents discussing Sarah's wedding plans, completely ignoring my presence. "She'll need a generous contribution from Emily. She always comes through," my mother said with a laugh. My heart sank as I realized that I was merely a financial resource to them. It felt like a punch to the gut, and I could feel my stomach twist in knots. I was supposed to be part of this family, not just a bank account they could dip into whenever they needed. That was the moment I found the text message on Sarah's phone, revealing her secret gambling addiction. I had been scrolling through her phone while she chatted with her friends, trying to look busy and avoid the awkwardness of the party. But my curiosity got the better of me, and when I saw the messages I froze. The texts were filled with panic and desperation, discussing debts that were piling up, and references to bets she had made. It was all right there in front of me, laid out in black and white. Sarah was drowning in her own choices, and I was still expected to pick up the pieces. The laughter around me turned into a sickening hum as I processed the betrayal. I had always seen Sarah as the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. But now I felt a wave of anger rising. Not only was I expected to contribute to her wedding, but I was also being set up to bail her out of a personal crisis that she had created on her own. I was done being the family doormat. No more silence, it was time for action. I could feel the anxiety creeping up my throat. Here I was at my sister's engagement party, supposed to be celebrating her happiness, but it felt like a cruel joke. I was the overlooked daughter, the one who was always in the shadows, and now I was also the one expected to support the weight of her mistakes. I glanced around the room, observing the happy faces, the laughter, and the excitement, and I felt completely out of place. I thought about all the times I had been there for Sarah, supporting her, cheering her on, while my own achievements went unrecognized. I had sacrificed my own happiness for the sake of family harmony, and for what? To be treated like a backup plan? I was tired of being the invisible sister, the one who was always overshadowed by Sarah's light. I had spent years feeling inadequate, constantly measuring myself against her successes, and it was exhausting. As I stood there, I could feel the weight of my parents' expectations pressing down on me. They had never acknowledged my struggles, my hard work, or my accomplishments. Instead, they had always compared me to Sarah, making me feel less than. The emotional toll was becoming unbearable. I felt like a ghost in my own family, drifting through life without a voice, without a say. The realization hit me hard. I was tired of living in a constant state of comparison. I didn't want to be the sister who was always behind, the one who was expected to support everyone else while my own needs were pushed aside. I needed to stand up for myself, to reclaim my own narrative, and I needed to do it now. The pressure was mounting, and I could sense that something had to give. With my heart racing, I decided I couldn't let this go on any longer. I had to confront my family about the toxic dynamics at play. I could no longer be the silent observer in my own life, trapped in a cycle of favoritism and emotional neglect. No matter the outcome, standing up for myself was the only way I could move forward. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation that was about to unfold. As I watched Sarah laugh and chat with her friends, oblivious to the chaos brewing beneath the surface, I felt a surge of determination. I was ready to break the cycle of favoritism and demand the respect I deserved. I was done being the silent sister, the one who always came through financially and emotionally. It was time to take my stand. I took a deep breath and approached my parents, gathering all the courage I had left. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. I was tired of being the backup plan, the one who was always expected to support Sarah and pick up the pieces of her life. This time it had to be different. I won't be paying for Sarah's wedding or any of her debts. I've supported her long enough, and this stops now, I said, my voice steady but filled with a mix of anxiety and determination. It felt like the words had been trapped inside me for far too long, and now they were finally breaking free. My mother's face twisted in disbelief, her eyes narrowing as if she couldn't comprehend what I had just said. "You can't just abandon your sister," she exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch. I could see the disappointment etched on her face, and it stung, but I had to push through. "This is not about abandonment, it's about boundaries." "I deserve respect too," I replied, my tone firm. I thought of all the times my accomplishments had been dismissed, the hours of work I had put in that went unnoticed. I was finally standing up for myself, and it felt terrifying yet liberating. Instead of listening to my words, they dismissed my concerns as if I hadn't even spoken. I watched as they turned their attention back to planning the wedding arrangements, discussing the details as if my declaration hadn't shattered the illusion of family harmony. The tension in the air thickened, and I could feel the pressure building around us. The dismissive attitude from my parents only fueled my resolve. I couldn't let them treat me like I was invisible anymore. I had spent far too long living in Sarah's shadow, always being compared to her and expected to play the role of the supportive sister. But I was done with that. I was reclaiming my narrative. As I stood there, I felt a mix of anger and determination bubbling inside me. I had always been the one who came through for my family, the one they could rely on when things got tough. But now, I was tired of being seen as just a resource, a financial contributor to their plans. I was a person with my own dreams and aspirations, and it was time for my family to recognize that. The room was filled with the sounds of laughter and celebration, but I felt completely out of place. It was as if I was standing in a different world, where my feelings and desires didn't matter. I glanced around at the guests, who were blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing within my family. I felt like I was the only one who could see the cracks forming in the facade of our happy family. I could sense the frustration building in my chest, and I knew I had to choose my words carefully. I didn't want to escalate the situation, but I also couldn't back down. I had to be clear about my boundaries while still standing my ground. I'm not going to support this wedding financially, and I won't be a part of bailing Sarah out of her mess anymore. I need to focus on my own life and goals, I said, my voice steady. I could feel the eyes of my parents on me, and the silence that followed was deafening. My mother opened her mouth to protest, but I raised my hand to stop her. I needed to make my point clear. You have always expected me to be there for Sarah, to put her needs above my own. But I can't do that anymore. I have my own life to live, and I refuse to be weighed down by this toxic cycle any longer. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could see the disbelief on my father's face. He had always been the silent supporter of my mother's decisions, and I could sense that he was struggling to find his voice. "What kind of daughter would you be if you turned your back on family?" my mother asked, desperation creeping into her voice. I could see the fear in her eyes, but I had to stay firm. "A daughter who respects herself and her own boundaries," I replied, feeling a surge of strength. I had spent too long allowing my family to dictate my worth, and I was no longer willing to accept that role. As I stood there, I could feel the chaos unfolding around us. I could sense the panic creeping into my parents as they realized that their plans were unraveling without my support. I was finally taking control of my own narrative, and it felt exhilarating. I took a step back, giving them space to process what had just happened. I could see the shock on their faces, and for the first time, I felt like I was breaking free from the chains that had held me down for so long. It was terrifying but liberating, and I knew there was no going back now. As the night progressed, my parents ramped up their tactics. They cornered me, insisting, "You can't let your sister down now, she needs you." My mother looked desperate, her voice dripping with guilt. "What kind of daughter would you be if you turned your back on family?" They completely disregarded my feelings, focusing solely on the benefits I brought to the table. The pressure was suffocating. It was as if I had to choose between my dignity and their approval. I felt anger boiling inside me, but I knew I had to keep my composure. The stakes were high, and I could sense the chaos about to erupt. I glanced around the room, noticing the faces of the guests who were enjoying the party, unaware of the storm brewing in my family. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump into the unknown. It was a terrifying prospect, but the thought of continuing to live under my family's expectations was even more daunting. "Emily, you've always been the strong one, the reliable one," my father chimed in, his tone almost pleading. "Your sister is going through a tough time. She needs your support now more than ever." Their words were meant to tug at my heartstrings, but instead, they ignited a fire within me. Did they really believe that I owed my life to Sarah? That I had to sacrifice my own happiness for her mistakes? I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. They were trying to manipulate me with guilt, but I was done being their emotional punching bag. I had spent years accommodating their needs, bending over backward to make everyone else happy, while neglecting my own desires. But now it was time to put myself first. "I get that Sarah's struggling, but that's not my responsibility. I won't be her safety net anymore," I replied, my voice steady but laced with a firmness that surprised even me. I wasn't about to let them guilt-trip me into a corner. "You're being selfish, Emily," my mother shouted, her face flushed with anger. "What kind of sister are you? You should be supporting her, helping her through this. She's about to get married." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. Here I was, the invisible sister, and yet I was the one being held to a standard that felt impossible to meet. Sarah's wedding was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but it had become a weapon they were using against me. I realized then that my parents had no intention of seeing me as a person with my own needs and emotions. I was just a means to an end, a way to keep their perfect family image intact. As the pressure mounted, I felt a rush of adrenaline. I knew I had to make a stand to break free from the cycle of obligation and guilt. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was about to unfold. I glanced at Sarah, who was blissfully unaware of the chaos unraveling around her, lost in her own world of wedding planning. It made me realize that she had never truly understood the burden I carried, nor had she ever cared to. It was time to take control of my own narrative. "You think I'm being selfish? You think this is about me not wanting to help? No. It's about me finally setting boundaries after years of being the family doormat," I exclaimed, my voice rising with passion. The room fell silent, and I could feel the weight of their shocked expressions on me. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of realization in my mother's eyes, but then it was gone, replaced by outrage. "You're tearing this family apart," she yelled, her voice trembling with fury. I stood my ground, refusing to let their anger shake my resolve. Maybe it's time for the family to face the truth instead of sweeping everything under the rug. "I'm not a bank account. I'm your daughter," I shouted back, my heart racing. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and I could see that my parents were struggling to comprehend my words. They were so used to manipulating the narrative that they couldn't fathom a reality where I didn't fall in line with their expectations. "You've ruined everything, Emily," my mother cried, her voice cracking. "Your sister deserves this, and you're just being selfish." I could see her frustration boiling over, and I wouldn't back down now. Their anger felt like a tidal wave crashing over me, but I was ready to swim against it. I had spent far too long drowning in their expectations, and I wasn't going to let that happen anymore. I had finally found my voice, and I wasn't going to let them silence me. "Maybe it's time for you to realize that I'm not going to be your scapegoat anymore," I shouted, feeling a sense of empowerment flood through me. The shock on their faces fueled my determination. I was ready to break free from the chains that had held me down for so long, ready to reclaim my identity and my worth. The chaos continued to unfold around me, but I was no longer afraid. I had taken my stand, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I was done being the invisible daughter, the one who was expected to support everyone while my own needs were disregarded. As the party continued, I could see the disbelief on the faces of my family. They were struggling to come to terms with my newfound strength, and for the first time I felt a sense of liberation. I was finally breaking free from the toxic dynamics that had held me captive for far too long. The engagement party reached its climax when my parents announced a toast, expecting me to join in celebrating Sarah's engagement. Silence filled the room as all eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of their expectations heavy on my shoulders. This was the moment where I could either give in or stand my ground. Instead of raising my glass, I remained silent, letting the awkwardness linger. I could see my parents exchanging nervous glances, waiting for me to crack under the pressure. In that moment I knew it was time to make my stance clear. I was tired of being the backup, the one who always had to play along with their narrative. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension around me. "You want to throw a perfect party?" I finally said, my voice cold and steady. "Then good luck with that, because I'm not contributing another dime." I turned my back on them, leaving the room in stunned silence. For the first time I felt a rush of liberation. The shock on their faces was priceless, and I could sense the panic setting in. My decision had thrown a wrench into their carefully laid plans. They had always relied on me to bail them out, and now they were left with nothing. My parents began to react angrily. "You've ruined everything," my mother screamed, her face a mix of rage and disbelief. Sarah, caught in the emotional whirlwind, joined in, blaming me for her engagement's downfall. "You're so selfish, Emily," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Their accusations were hurtful, but I held my ground. I wouldn't let their anger sway me. This was my moment to reclaim my voice. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and I could feel the eyes of the other guests on us. Some whispered among themselves, clearly taken aback by the scene unfolding before them. It was as if my family was unraveling right in front of their eyes. I stood there, feeling the weight of their judgment but knowing that I had to prioritize myself. "You're being unreasonable. What kind of daughter would turn her back on her family?" my mother continued, desperation creeping into her tone. I realized then that they were grasping at straws, trying to manipulate my emotions with guilt. A daughter who finally respects herself and sets boundaries. I shot back, my voice steady. I had spent too long accommodating their needs, and I wasn't going to let them guilt me into submission any longer. As my family continued to lash out, it became clear that they weren't ready to accept my decision. They had always relied on my compliance, and without it they were spinning out of control. The facade of our happy family was crumbling, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had broken the cycle. In that moment I realized I was no longer afraid of their judgment. The truth was out in the open and I had nothing to lose. I had finally taken a stand for myself, and it felt exhilarating. I could see the panic in their eyes, and for the first time I felt empowered. As I walked away from the confrontation I felt lighter. I had finally taken control of my own narrative. No longer the invisible sister. I had stepped into my power and refused to let my family dictate my worth. I was ready to embrace my independence and live life on my own terms. I took a deep breath and decided to let the chaos unfold. I had spent so long being the reliable one, the one who always came through for my family, and I was done being their emotional safety net. I looked at my parents, who were clearly struggling to process what was happening. They had always relied on my support, expecting me to be the person who would make everything right. But I was tired of playing that role. "You want to throw a perfect party?" I said coldly, my voice steady. "Then good luck with that, because I'm not contributing another dime." My words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and I could feel the shock ripple through the room. I turned my back on them, walking away from the stunned silence that followed. As I stepped away, I could see the looks of disbelief on their faces. My mother's mouth was agape, and my father was shaking his head in denial. They were so used to me falling in line, to me being the one who fixed everything, and now, without my support, they were left floundering. I felt a rush of liberation, a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in my life I had taken a stand, and it felt exhilarating. The guests at the party were whispering among themselves, clearly taken aback by the scene. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed genuinely concerned about the family drama unfolding in front of them. I could hear snippets of conversation. "Did you hear what she just said? And I can't believe this is happening at Sarah's engagement party." It was as if my family's dysfunction was now on full display for everyone to see. My parents were beginning to react with anger, their frustration boiling over. "You've ruined everything," my mother screamed, her voice filled with rage. I could see the color rising in her cheeks, the way her eyes burned with fury. It was a familiar sight, but this time, instead of cowering, I stood my ground. I was done being the family scapegoat. Sarah, caught up in the emotional whirlwind, joined in the chorus of blame. "You're so selfish, Emily," she cried, tears streaming down her face. I had always been the reliable sister, the one who supported her, and now she was turning on me. But I wouldn't let their accusations pierce my resolve. I had spent too long allowing their guilt and anger to dictate my worth. I felt a mix of anger and empowerment. It was as if I was finally breaking free from the chains that had held me captive for so long. I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me, but I refused to let it crush me. I had always been the good daughter, the one who played along with their narrative. But now I was ready to rewrite my story. I could see the panic spreading among my family. Without my financial support, their carefully laid plans were unraveling before their eyes. I overheard one of the guests whisper, "Wait, is it true that Sarah has a gambling problem?" The truth was out, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. My family's facade was crumbling, and their incompetence was exposed. "Emily, you need to understand how much this means to your sister," my father pleaded, his voice trembling with desperation. It was a last-ditch effort to manipulate me, to make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. But I was done being manipulated. I was a person with my own dreams and aspirations, and I refused to let them dictate my happiness any longer. "You're being unreasonable," my mother shouted, her face a mask of anger and disbelief. What kind of daughter would turn her back on her family? Their words were meant to guilt me, to make me feel like I was betraying them. But I was no longer afraid of their judgment. I had finally found my voice, and I wasn't going to let them silence me. A daughter who respects herself and her own boundaries. I shot back, my voice steady and filled with conviction. I could feel the eyes of the other guests on us, some shaking their heads in disbelief at my family's behavior. It was a surreal moment, and I felt a strange mix of clarity and strength. The atmosphere was thick with tension as my family continued to lash out. They were angry and desperate, grasping at straws to regain control over me. But I was done being their emotional punching bag. I had spent years accommodating their needs and neglecting my own desires. I stood tall, refusing to let their anger shake my resolve. I was ready to embrace my independence, ready to break free from the toxic dynamics that had held me captive for so long. I could see the disbelief on their faces, and for the first time I felt empowered. As the chaos continued to unfold, I realized that I had taken control of my narrative. I was no longer the invisible sister, the one who was expected to support everyone else while my own needs were disregarded. I had finally stepped into my power, and it felt incredible. I could see the panic in my family's eyes, and instead of feeling guilty, I felt a rush of exhilaration. In that moment, I understood that breaking free from their expectations was the first step toward reclaiming my identity. I had spent too long living in Sarah's shadow, always being compared to her and expected to play the role of the supportive sister. But now I was ready to live my life on my own terms. I had made my choice and there was no going back. As I walked away from the confrontation, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I had finally broken free from the chains that had held me down for so long, and I was ready to embrace a new chapter in my life, one filled with independence, self-respect, and the freedom to be who I truly was. Instead of accepting my decision with any sense of understanding or remorse, my family erupted in anger, revealing just how deep their dysfunction ran. "You've ruined everything," my mother screamed, her face turning a shade of crimson that I had seen countless times before. The fury in her voice, the sharpness of her words, and the way her eyes glinted with betrayal were all too familiar. It was as if the years of my being a dutiful daughter meant nothing now that I had stood up for myself. Sarah, caught in the emotional whirlwind of the moment, joined in the attack. "You're so selfish, Emily," she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her tears. The irony of the situation hit me hard. Here was my sister, the golden child, the one who had everything handed to her, claiming I was selfish for finally prioritizing my own well-being. I had always been the reliable sister, the one who supported her every step of the way. Yet, in this moment of chaos, she had turned against me, grasping at the last threads of her own happiness. Their accusations flew at me like daggers, each one hitting a mark that I had long since fortified against. I felt the familiar sting of guilt creeping in, but I held my ground, refusing to let their words penetrate my resolve. I noticed the guests around us, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort, some whispering among themselves, clearly taken aback by my family's behavior. I could almost hear the whispers swirling around. "Did you see how she just stood there? And this is supposed to be a celebration?" The truth was painfully clear. My family's unraveling was now on full display for everyone to witness. As my mother continued her tirade, desperation crept into her voice. "What kind of daughter would you be if you turned your back on family?" she demanded, her eyes flashing with indignation. I could feel the pressure building, the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. It was as if I had to choose between my dignity and their approval, and I was not about to back down. "A daughter who finally respects herself and sets boundaries," I replied, my voice steady and filled with conviction. I had spent years allowing their guilt and anger to dictate my worth, and I was done. For too long I had been the family doormat, the one who was expected to come through at a moment's notice, and I was through with it. My mother's face twisted in disbelief as she processed my words. "You're being unreasonable," she spat, her frustration boiling over. "How could you do this to your sister?" I could see the panic in her eyes, the way she was struggling to regain control over the narrative that had spun out of her grasp. I realized that they were so used to me falling in line, to me accommodating their needs, that the very thought of me standing up for myself was incomprehensible to them. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Emily," Sarah chimed in, her voice rising in pitch as she fought back her tears. The accusatory tone in her voice felt like an arrow aimed directly at my heart, but I refused to flinch. I had spent far too long drowning in their expectations, and I wasn't going to let that happen anymore. I had finally found my voice, and I wasn't going to let them silence me. "Maybe it's time for you to realize that I'm not going to be your scapegoat anymore," I shot back, my heart racing as I felt a wave of empowerment wash over me. The shock on their faces was priceless, and for the first time, I felt a sense of liberation. I was breaking free from the toxic dynamics that had held me captive for so long, and I could see panic spreading among my family. Without my financial support and emotional backing, their carefully laid plans were unraveling before their eyes. I overheard one of the guests whisper, "Wait, is it true that Sarah has a gambling problem?" The truth was out, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. My family's facade was crumbling, and their true incompetence was exposed. I realized I hadn't lost anything by stepping away. I had gained my freedom. "Emily, you need to understand how much this means to your sister," my father pleaded, his voice trembling with desperation as he tried to manipulate me back into compliance. I could see how he was struggling to maintain control over the situation, but I was done being manipulated. I was a person with my own dreams and aspirations, and I refused to let them dictate my happiness any longer. "A daughter who finally values her own worth," I exclaimed, my voice filled with determination. I could feel the eyes of the other guests on us, some shaking their heads in disbelief at my family's behavior. The tension in the room was palpable, and I knew that I had crossed a line that they had never expected me to breach. I was no longer the obedient daughter, the one who played along with their narrative. I was ready to embrace my independence, ready to break free from the toxic dynamics that had held me captive for so long. As the chaos continued to unfold, I realized that in that moment, I had taken control of my narrative. I was no longer the invisible sister, the one who was expected to support everyone else while my own needs were disregarded. I had finally stepped into my power, and I felt invigorated by the strength I had found within myself. In that moment of confrontation, I felt the weight of my family's expectations begin to lift. I was ready to embrace a new chapter in my life, one filled with independence, self-respect, and the freedom to be who I truly was. I walked away from the confrontation feeling lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I had finally broken free from the chains that had held me down for so long, and I was ready to live life on my own terms. As the evening continued, it became evident that Sarah's engagement was unraveling. Without my financial support, panic set in among my family. I overheard my father mutter, "What are we going to do now?" His voice was low, tinged with a hint of desperation. I could see the helplessness in his eyes. He was not used to being in this position where he had to face the consequences of their reliance on me. The facade they had built was crumbling, and the cracks were becoming too large to ignore. I glanced around the room and noticed the guests shifting uncomfortably. Whispers filled the air, and I could hear snippets of conversations that confirmed my suspicions. "Did you hear that Emily won't help with the wedding? And I can't believe this is happening at Sarah's engagement party." It was surreal to see my family's dysfunction laid bare for everyone to witness. The truth was on display, and for once I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't the only one who could see the reality of the situation. Others were beginning to see it too. My mother, who was usually so composed, was now pacing the room, her hands wringing in frustration. "Emily, you need to understand how much this means to your sister," she exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch as if that would somehow change my mind. I could see the desperation in her eyes as she tried to reason with me, but it only fueled my resolve. It was as if she thought that by raising her voice, she could somehow manipulate me back into compliance. But I was done with manipulation. I was done being the one who always came through. I had spent years accommodating their needs while neglecting my own, and I wasn't going to allow that to happen anymore. I had found my voice, and I was not about to let them silence me. "What kind of daughter would you be if you turned your back on your family?" my mother asked, her tone dripping with accusation. I could feel the weight of her words, but this time, instead of crumbling under the pressure, I stood my ground. "A daughter who finally respects herself and sets boundaries." I shot back, my voice steady and filled with conviction. The atmosphere in the room shifted. I could feel the tension thickening as my family struggled to process my defiance. Instead of backing down, they doubled down on their attempts to guilt me into submission. "You've ruined everything," my mother screamed, her eyes wide with anger. I could see that she was genuinely shocked by my refusal to comply. It was a familiar sight, but this time I felt no guilt. I was reclaiming my power, and it felt exhilarating. Sarah, still caught up in her whirlwind of confusion and anger, joined the attack. "You're so selfish, Emily," she cried, tears streaming down her face. The irony was not lost on me. Here was my sister, the golden child, the one who had everything handed to her, accusing me of being selfish because I had finally prioritized my own well-being. I had always been the reliable sister, the one who supported her every step of the way, yet now she had turned on me. I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar sting of guilt creeping in. But I refused to let their words penetrate my resolve. I had spent far too long allowing their anger and guilt to dictate my worth. I was done being the family doormat. I was ready to embrace my independence. The guests were now openly whispering, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed genuinely concerned about the family drama unfolding in front of them. I could hear snippets of conversation. "Did you see how she just stood there? And this is supposed to be a celebration." It was as if my family's dysfunction was now on full display for everyone to see. As my parents continued their tirade, desperation crept into their voices. "You can't just abandon your sister," my mother cried, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I could feel the pressure building, the weight of their expectations pressing down on me, but I was not about to back down. I had finally found my voice, and I wasn't going to let them silence me. "Maybe it's time for you to realize that I'm not going to be your scapegoat anymore." I shot back, my heart racing as I felt a wave of empowerment wash over me. The shock on their faces was priceless, and for the first time, I felt a sense of liberation. I was breaking free from the toxic dynamics that had held me captive for so long, and I could see panic spreading among my family. Without my financial support, their carefully laid plans were unraveling before their eyes. I overheard one of the guests whisper, "Wait, is it true that Sarah has a gambling problem?" The truth was out, and I felt a surge of relief wash over me. My family's facade was crumbling, and their true incompetence was exposed. I realized I hadn't lost anything by stepping away. I had gained my freedom. "You need to understand how much this means to your sister," my father pleaded, his voice trembling with desperation. It was a last-ditch effort to manipulate me, to make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. But I was done being manipulated. I was a person with my own dreams and aspirations, and I refused to let them dictate my happiness any longer. "A daughter who finally values her own worth," I exclaimed, my voice filled with determination. I could feel the eyes of the other guests on us, some shaking their heads in disbelief at my family's behavior. The tension in the room was palpable, and I knew that I had crossed a line that they had never expected me to breach. As the chaos continued to unfold, I realized that I had finally taken control of my narrative. I was no longer the invisible sister, the one who was expected to support everyone else while my own needs were disregarded. I had finally stepped into my power, and it felt incredible. In that moment of confrontation, I felt the weight of my family's expectations begin to lift. I was ready to embrace a new chapter in my life, one filled with independence, self-respect, and the freedom to be who I truly was. Months later, I reflected on that night and the chaos that ensued. I had distanced myself from my family, focusing on my own life and goals. The weight of their expectations was finally gone, and I felt lighter than I had in years. I no longer felt the need to seek their approval or live under their shadow. It was a liberating feeling. I had built a new support system, surrounding myself with friends who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. We laughed, shared stories, and celebrated each other's achievements. It was everything I had longed for. A sense of belonging that wasn't defined by toxic dynamics. My phone buzzed with messages from my family, filled with complaints and passive-aggressive remarks, but I simply ignored them. I didn't engage. I realized that I had the power to choose who I wanted in my life. Whenever I thought about the engagement party, I felt a surge of pride. I had taken a stand, and it was a turning point for me. I had reclaimed my narrative and set boundaries that were long overdue. The victory was mine. I had found peace in my independence, unburdened by their toxic dynamics. The silence in my life was comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos I had grown accustomed to. I took a deep breath, grateful for the space I had created for myself. Life was no longer about meeting their expectations. It was about living authentically and pursuing my passions. I had finally found my way, and it felt incredible.